Sup, team? This is a paper from the Journal of Social Science, Volume 9, 2019. It's titled Antisemitism and the Left, Confronting an Invisible Racism by Sina, Arnold, and Blair Taylor. I have essays by both of these authors on the YouTube channel, so, check them out. And so it has a bio here. It says Blair Taylor, PhD in politics from the New School for Social Research, is program director of the Institute for Social Ecology. Blair Taylor has published on the history of the left, anarchism, right-wing ecology, and post-colonial theory. Sina Arnold is a PhD in social and cultural anthropology, is a lecturer and researcher at the Center for Research on Antisemitism at the Technische Universität Berlin. Arnold's work focuses on migration, contemporary anti-Semitism, and racism. Both have been activists and educators involved in left social movements for over 25 years. Alright, so this is the abstract. The resurgence of anti-Semitism from the deadly Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, the alt-right's chant of, quote, "Jews will not replace us," end quote, up to recent controversies within the Women's March and UK Labour Party caught many observers off guard. Although anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States, anti-Semitism has, until recently, remained conspicuously absent from progressive/left discourse and activism. These recent incidents have restored the term to the lexicon of the left. However, there remains a tendency to focus exclusively on the more deadly anti-Semitism of the right, while remaining silent about less deadly manifestations on the left. This article seeks to fill this political and analytical void by highlighting this, quote, invisible, end quote, form of racism, challenging some common assumptions found on the left, and offering analytical and political tools rooted in an emancipatory perspective. We show that the left has a long and complicated historical relationship with anti-Semitism. By focusing on how anti-Semitism can manifest in left critiques of capitalism or global politics, we illustrate how anti-Semitism both overlaps with and diverges from the anti-Semitism of the right. We use recent examples to describe common rhetorical strategies employed to deny or downplay the existence of anti-Semitism within left movements, or derail conversations about it from taking place. As anti-Semitism continues to shape the contemporary political landscape, we argue that emancipatory movements must become familiar with its specific contours and actively address it in their political work. End of the abstract. Now it's time for the real McCoy. Introduction. The resurgence of anti-Semitism from the deadly Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, the alt-right's chant of "Jews will not replace us," up to recent controversies within the Women's March and UK Labour Party caught many observers off guard. Although anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States and globally, it has until recently remained conspicuously absent from progressive/left discourse and political activism. This silence has been compounded by the fact that attempts to address anti-Semitism have frequently been met by a set of responses rather unusual within a left culture typically sensitive to claims of racism. Firstly, opposition to anti-Semitism is often presumed to be an automatic and inherent feature of belonging to the left. Since leftists oppose all forms of racism and oppression, this by definition includes anti-Semitism. Second, many progressives assume that anti-Semitism is no longer a serious or systematic social problem and therefore requires no specific attention, especially in comparison to anti-Black and anti-Arab racism. For commentary on this, see Rosenblum, 2007, Arnold, 2015, and Sunshine, 2017. Lastly, some leftists often claim that addressing anti-Semitism is only a cynical smokescreen for defending Israel. Quote, Hasbara, end quote, a euphemism for Israeli propaganda that disguises anti-Arab, Zionist, and other right-wing positions in anti-racist veneer. As a result of these dynamics, many on the left respond to allegations of anti-Semitism with uncharacteristic suspicion, if not derision, in some quarters abandoning it as an issue owned by the political right. Not that it necessarily means something, but it probably means something, but I don't know exactly what it means. But anything that I post that's about anti-Semitism, if I post, say, an essay by Jean Amery, it gets a lot of dislikes. I don't think you can see the dislikes. I don't know if I can make them public or whatever. But whenever there's anything by about, that questions left-wing narratives about Israel-Palestine or how that subject should be broached, it gets massive dislikes. And see, if you look at some of the comments, if you just scroll through some of the videos that are about those topics, you see some of the comments. Some of them are fucking insane. So, I don't know, maybe they're not all from leftists. But I'm going to assume if you're listening to this channel, you're probably pretty leftoid. And if you're like most leftists, you're not probably not very fun either. Just kidding. I'm sure you're wonderful. This article seeks to fill this political and analytical void by shining a light on a, quote, invisible, end quote, form of racism, challenging some common assumptions found on the left and offering analytical and political tools rooted in an emancipatory perspective. We will show that the left has a long and complicated historical relationship with anti-Semitism, a relationship including instances where anti-Semitism not only went unchallenged but was actively reproduced. This endeavor requires clarifying how anti-Semitism is different from other forms of racism, outlining anti-Semitism's core tropes and delineating anti-Semitism as a uniquely racialized worldview. We use recent examples to describe common rhetorical strategies employed to deny or downplay the existence of anti-Semitism within left movements, or derail conversations about anti-Semitism from taking place. We will also highlight key historical and intellectual shifts that have shaped how left movements do or do not discuss anti-Semitism, a legacy that continues to mold movement discourse today. Although the recent resurgence of virulent anti-Semitism has put the term back into the lexicon of the left, there remains a strong tendency to focus exclusively on the more deadly anti-Semitism of the right, while remaining silent on less violent manifestations on the left. It seems to me, maybe this is just to put it on, this is a little side note. It seems to me that anti-Semitism as manifesto on the left oftentimes takes the form of supporting people who are anti-Semitic. Even if they personally aren't anti-Semitic, they support people that are anti-Semitic on reactionary anti-imperialist, quasi-anti-imperialist grounds. Anyway, that's just a side comment from me. But Arnold and Taylor are probably trying to be diplomatic. Maybe I'm wrong. I get to hide behind the anonymity of the internet, so I don't have to be diplomatic. Okay. By focusing on how anti-Semitism can manifest in left critiques of capitalism, modernity, or global politics, we illustrate how it both overlaps with and diverges from the anti-Semitism of the right. Lastly, we will explore anti-Semitism in relation to the centrality of Israel and Palestine in contemporary left discourse, and the reluctance to grapple with complicated issues of framing, salience, and unwanted political bedfellows. This text focuses primarily on the left in the United States. American leftists often tend to see anti-Semitism as primarily a European phenomenon, one mostly restricted to the distant past. Certainly, there have been a few attempts to address contemporary anti-Semitism on the left, such as April Rosenblum's pamphlet, The Past Didn't Go Anywhere, the Marxist Initiative essay, Beware of Left Anti-Semitism, published in 2011, the collective open letter, Not Quite, quote, Ordinary Human Beings, end quote, Anti-Imperialism and the Anti-Humanist Rhetoric of Gilad Atzmon, published in 2012, Spencer Sunshine's The Left Must Root Out Anti-Semitism in Its Ranks, published in 2017, and Understanding Anti-Semitism and Offering to Our Movement from Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. However, these resources remain largely unknown and invisible. Most non-Jewish Americans are aware of the long history of anti-Semitism in the United States, which, if acknowledged at all, is understood as a problem of the past and not the present. By contrast, we will demonstrate that anti-Semitism continues to be a threat globally, including in the United States. For this reason, confronting anti-Semitism in theory and practice is a necessary component of any emancipatory anti-racist politics or theory. This requires becoming aware of the history of anti-Semitism on the left and acknowledging that left movements have, until very recently and with few exceptions, mostly overlooked this form of oppression. While the left has no problem identifying and denouncing the more overt and deadly manifestations of anti-Semitism on the right, it has difficulty seeing and addressing more subtle forms on the left. As we detail below, left activists often react As we detail below, left activists often react defensively to allegations of anti-Semitism. It is not dismissed as a smear. One frequently hears that, if it is not dismissed as a smear, one frequently hears that right anti-Semitism is worse. In our view, these patterns are not the result of conscious anti-Semitic intent. I would agree with that. But rather ignorance of what constitutes anti-Semitism and unexamined political assumptions. Definitely agree with that. Sorry, you don't have to hear what I agree with. I just think that's important. Is that, obviously not necessarily, well, sometimes it's the case, but not necessarily does prejudice, and particularly left-wing anti-Semitism, usually manifests itself in a self-consciously hateful and malicious way. That's just a side comment. But in the face of growing threats and violence to Jewish people across the globe, such responses are insufficient. We therefore hope this article can make a small contribution to the articulation of an emancipatory analysis of anti-Semitism. What is anti-Semitism? Perhaps the most common reason why leftists overlook anti-Semitism is that they assume anti-Semitism functions the same as other forms of racism, thus missing those features which make anti-Semitism specific and distinct. It certainly can and does take the form of simple racial prejudice or discrimination against Jews, and on the far right, overt or biological race hatred is still common. However, anti-Semitism is unique in that historically anti-Semitism evolved as part of a broader anti-modern ideology closely linked to the rise of bourgeois society, i.e. capitalism, cosmopolitanism, and the modern nation-state. See for instance Bentz, 2005, and Volkov, 2017, 1978. I don't know if this is who they're referring to in the Benz, but the book, I believe it's titled A Concise Introduction to the Third Reich by Wolfgang Benz. If that's the Benz that they're referencing, is a tremendous introduction to the history of Nazi Germany and with solid analysis of anti-Semitism. To my memory, maybe it sucked. Maybe I wouldn't agree with some of the things now, that knowing more than I did when I first read it. But if you're looking for an introduction, that's a great one. I read it as part of a History of Nazi Germany course in undergrad. Of course, anti-Semitism has many elements in common with other forms of racism. Jews as a group are essentialized. Jews are assigned negative attributes and discriminated against in various areas of life, features shared by all racisms. There are, however, also important differences between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. Just as there are differences in the specific forms of racism towards blacks, Asians, Arabs, and other groups. In general terms, what might be called, quote, colonial, end quote, forms of racism directed at colonized people, indigenous groups, or African slaves construct, quote, the other, end quote, as inferior, uncivilized, and subhuman. This, quote, other, end quote, symbolizes nature and uncontrollable sexuality and is associated with the body and emotion in contrast to mind and reason. This in turn leads to characterizations as less intelligent, criminal, and lazy. Presented as inferior, it is therefore assumed that this, quote, other, end quote, must be suppressed, exploited, and excluded. See Arnold, 2018. By contrast, quote, the Jew, end quote, is generally less associated with nature but with modern society. Jews are, quote, over-civilized, end quote, suspiciously intelligent and physically weak, rootless cosmopolitans lacking loyalty to community or country. Jews are depicted as overly individualistic, yet at the same time cliquishly tribal, money-grubbing materialists who have grown powerful and wealthy through dishonesty and trickery. In short, Jews are the personification of all the negative aspects of modern society. As, quote, the Jews, end quote, are perceived as either openly running the world or secretly conspiring to do so, anti-Semitism ultimately does not seek to merely keep, quote, the other, end quote, down, but rather to destroy their perceived hegemonic power. Nazi eliminationism would take this to its logical conclusion. Yeah, there's a... Yeah, that kind of seemed, I don't know, this is just a thought to myself. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like, what distinguishes, what makes a lot of other racisms in terms of like the subhuman, representing like the unbridled sexuality, or like the terror or something like that of nature, being represented by the colonized racial ascriptions. Anti-Semitism seems like one of the parts about anti-Semitism that is unique is that and this is why it lends itself to eliminationist and genocidal intentions, is that Jews are not considered just less than, or animals or something like that, or uncivilized, or who just are irresponsible and just fuck anything that moves, and all those kinds of like can't keep their hands off of other people's property or something like that. Well, I guess there's a way that's true of anti-Semitic stereotypes as well. But in such cases, like even though there obviously is like extreme barbaric violence involved in exploiting colonized people and the descendants of colonized people, racialized others. because they're dehumanized and regarded as animals ripe for exploitation and exclusion from large parts of social life. Anti-Semitism seems to me is inclined to categorize Jews with the label evil. Not just less than, but bad and cosmically bad. And not just bad for, one group of people in a particular context, say, oh, they're not just bad for, Germany, they're bad for the world. It seemed like Nazi anti-Semitism had very much in its idea that it was perpetrated the Holocaust, that it was doing the world a favor by doing so, by eliminating this evil, corrupting, exploitative threat. That seems like the relation between the last sentence where it says, anti-Semitism ultimately does not seek to merely keep, quote, the other, end quote, down, but rather to destroy their perceived hegemonic power. Nazi eliminationism would take this to its logical conclusion. Anyway, back to the text. Theodore W. Adorno and Max Horkheimer's classic Dialectic of Enlightenment treats anti-Semitism as a pathological expression of capitalism's tendency to abolish the possibility of a radically different world. Dialectic of Enlightenment describes how the experience of the domination inherent to capitalist society based on the unending drive for profit rather than human need can become hatred towards Jews. Quote, no matter what the makeup of the Jews may be in reality, the Jew's image, that of the defeated, has characteristics which must make totalitarian rule their mortal enemy. Happiness without power, reward without work, a homeland without frontiers, religion without myth. These features are outlawed by the ruling powers because they are secretly covered by the ruled. End quote. I'm wondering if covered was supposed to be coveted. It's a typo. I'm not sure, though. Maybe not. We'll just say that it says covered. End quote. Adorno and Horkheimer, Dialectic of Enlightenment. It is precisely this posture as a critique of power and capitalism that has made the left more susceptible to anti-Semitism than other forms of racism. It is no accident the German socialist leader August Bebel was quoted as calling anti-Semitism, quote, socialism of fools, end quote. See Adorno and Horkheimer, Moish Pistone, and Battini. Thus, although anti-Semitism includes prejudice and discrimination based on racialized group categories, on a more fundamental level, anti-Semitism is an expansive anti-modern worldview offered as a supposed critique of bourgeois society. Anti-Semitism targets central features of modern society: abstractness, universality, mobility, cosmopolitanism, and capitalism, all of which become identified with and personified as, quote, the Jew, end quote. Understanding the distinctive nature of anti-Semitism is crucial to recognizing anti-Semitism. As anti-Semitism is a worldview, one's subject, position, or identity provides no immunity against it. Leftists are rightly unconvinced when the right legitimizes racism by holding up Clarence Thomas or Thomas Sowell or dismiss sexism via Laura Southern or Phyllis Schlafly. Likewise, Jews, people of color, and professed anti-racist are not immune from reproducing anti-Semitic stereotypes. Yeah, I mean, this just a side comment. I mean, it seems like those people like fucking the fuck is her name? Oh my god, I can't think of her name. Who is that woman? But the other person I was thinking is was it Milo Yiannopoulos or whatever? One of those things those people did, maybe intentionally, maybe not, is like to show that um someone's identity has no necessary connection to any set of political beliefs whatsoever. There's not something inherently progressive about one's identity strictly on the grounds that that identity's oppression would be alleviated uh, if progressive uh, changes were made. Um, when people say, what the fuck is her name? Cannot think of the girl's name. The young like black girl who's like is always saying kinds of all kinds of racist shit. When people hear people like that talk, they fucking like laugh. But for some reason, when you talk about anti-Semitism, that's really not the case. So whenever there's like when anti-Semitism is being discussed, if someone says, well, as a Jew, I, think X, Y, and Z, that has some, you know, like, in and of itself means something important. What the fuck is that girl's name? God, I have to look it up now. It's gonna drive me fucking insane. Candace Owens. Jesus Christ, that's the name I was thinking of. Fuck. Candace Owens. When people see Candace Owens, they fucking laugh. Wait, let me get back to the sentence. As anti-Semitism is a worldview, one's subject position or identity provides no immunity against it. Leftists are rightly unconvinced when the right legitimizes racism by holding up Clarence Thomas or Thomas Sowell, or dismiss sexism via Laura Southern or Phyllis Schlafly. Likewise, Jews, people of color, and professed anti-racist are not immune from reproducing anti-Semitic stereotypes. God, repeating that just made me think of another thing. It's like it's not Norman Finkelstein. That great mind, said it's not anti-Semitic if it's true. In response to someone saying that Jews think they're better than everyone else. Because according to Norman Finkelstein, Jews in fact do think they're better than everyone else. So it's not racist or not anti-Semitic to say that Jews think they're superior to other groups of people. That would be a Jewish person reproducing an anti-Semitic stereotype. In contemporary left discussions of racism, privilege checking, call-out culture, and soul-searching have become the norm, while questioning such allegations is generally perceived as defending racism. Viewed in this context, the left's double standard regarding accusations of anti-Semitism is all the more glaring. Sorry. I know this is probably really fucking frustrating to listen to, but I have to save this image to my computer of this because it kind of summarizes so many things. So how's your mom? good. Mine's also good. She took a walk with me today. It was nice. A nice, solid, clear, crisp winter day. Alright, I'm done. Fuck my mom. Let's get back to the text. Okay. Antisemitism and the American Left, a Historical Perspective. A variety of historical examples make it clear that U.S. leftists have not been immune to anti-Semitic thinking. The populists of the late 19th century at times engaged in anti-Semitic industry that associated Jews with banks and economic exploitation, making the, quote, Jew a symbol of capitalism and urbanism, concepts in themselves too abstract to be satisfactory objects of animosity, end quote. The old left, and especially the Communist Party, was ambivalent regarding anti-Semitism, but generally aligned with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's CPSU position, including ignoring or endorsing anti-Semitic show trials, which portrayed Jewish party members as disloyal traitors in the Soviet Union under Stalin in Czechoslovakia and East Germany. Side note, Google Schlansky trials and doctor's plot. The political legacy of the New Left is of particular relevance. During the 1960s, anti-imperialism and anti-Zionism became increasingly central to New Left politics. Occasionally, the latter was expressed in anti-Semitic ways. Generally, this took the form of equating Jews with Israel and holding them collectively responsible for Israel actions. I think he might be a conservative, so, it's kind of hard when you're reading something to, take it seriously. But there's a book called, Antisemitism and the American Left. It might be by a conservative guy. But there's a picture in there of, that's from a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee picture, where, this I think it's a stereotypically Jewish person with a Star of David, Israel flag with a $ in the middle of it, putting Nasser and Muhammad Ali in chains. It's fucking horrific. But you don't really see it. If you Google it on the internet, you won't find it. It's in this particular book, so we'll have to see. But it couldn't have been, I don't think it could have been something from a far-right magazine, because it was clearly the Jews are oppressing the colonized. It was clearly the message of the image. But, yeah. Abundant examples can be found in back to the text. Abundant examples can be found in the New Left radical press, as when the Socialist Workers' Party paper claimed, quote, Jews contributed men, money, and influence to make Israel a reality and to perpetuate the crimes committed against Palestinians. The people of the book, ... changed roles from oppressed to oppressor, end quote. Forster and Epstein, 1974. A communique from the New World Liberation Front, an urban guerrilla group active in the 1970s, is more extreme. Quote, these Zionist ruling class pigs will not butcher poor people fighting for a just life without suffering drastic repercussions. The Jewish American ruling class cannot protect themselves well enough for a sufficient amount of time. They should consider this carefully. We will show the Jewish American ruling class how extremely vulnerable they are, here in the belly of the beast. Their lives will be in grave jeopardy if Mad Dog Rabin imposes this massacre on the Palestinian people, ... We call on all comrades to move directly against all Jewish American ruling class bloodsuckers if Rabin moves to massacre freedom fighters. These ruling class dogs are influential both here and in Israel and are extremely vulnerable, end quote. Here, American Jews are directly threatened with violence for the crimes of Israel and global capitalism, combined and embodied in the conspiratorial figure of the, quote, Jewish American ruling class, end quote, depicted as, quote, as parasitic, quote, bloodsuckers and, quote, dogs, which must be put down. The article was accompanied by a racist cartoon featuring stereotypical images of plotting, hooked-nosed Jews. During Jesse Jackson's 1984 presidential bid, this representative of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party referred to New York City as, quote, Hymietown, end quote, Hyme being a racist slur for Jews. Many leftists defended Jackson or tried to rationalize his comments. These examples of tolerance and apologetics for open anti-Semitism illuminate a persistent double standard in left discourse when compared to other forms of racism. The contemporary American left. If there was any doubt, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in 2018 forcefully demonstrated that anti-Semitism persists as a deadly threat. According to a 2014 poll, 26% of all respondents in 101 countries agreed to at least 6 out of 11 anti-Jewish statements. Anti-Defamation League, 2014. The United States was no exception. While anti-Semitic attitudes were less pronounced in the United States, 19% still judged the statement, quote, Jews have too much influence/control on Wall Street, end quote, as, quote, true, end quote, or, quote, probably true, end quote, while 14% agreed to the statement, quote, Jews today have too much influence in the United States, end quote. Anti-Semitic incidents, including physical assaults, vandalism, and attacks on Jewish institutions, spiked by nearly 60% in 2017, the largest single-year increase recorded, according to the Anti-Defamation League in 2018. Moreover, awareness towards historical anti-Semitism is not high. A recent national survey of Holocaust awareness and knowledge among U.S. adults revealed that there are not only significant gaps in historical knowledge about the Holocaust, but also that 70% of Americans say fewer people seem to care about the Holocaust than they used to. It's from the Claims Conference 2018. I was talking to my brother about this, and my brother, he's a true crime fan. And he listens to the podcast, Last Podcast on the Left. And they did a bit on, they did a couple episodes or whatever, he told me about Mengele. And they were apparently the hosts of the show were horrified because of how many emails and letters they got from people saying, young people, I don't know, maybe someone in high school or college age, early 20s, saying they didn't know the Holocaust happened. Which is fucking insane. I mean, this is kind of like an anecdotal story, and how true or how exaggerated it is I couldn't say, but there's an interesting kind of way this has kind of poked itself into my consciousness. These developments have effects on Jewish Americans. In a 2019 survey of American Jews, 84% of the respondents had the perception that anti-Semitism had increased over the past 5 years. 42% felt less secure than a year ago. American Jewish Committee, 2019. In the last 20 years, there have been 4 anti-Semitic mass shootings in the United States. In 2006, Naved Afzal Haq began a shooting spree at the Seattle Jewish Federation, screaming, quote, I am a Muslim American. I'm angry at Israel, end quote. In a subsequent 911 call, he declared his actions were politically motivated by George W. Bush, Islamophobia, Israel, and the Iraq War, standard left issues of the 2000s. In 2009, a white supremacist killed a security guard at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and in 2014, longtime white supremacist Fraser Glenn Miller went on a murderous rampage targeting a Jewish institution in Kansas City, killing 3. The Tree of Life shooter claimed 11 lives in 2018, shortly after posting online about, quote, the filthy, evil Jews, bringing the filthy, evil Muslims into the country, end quote. Yet in contrast to other outbursts of racist violence, with few exceptions, left-wing media outlets had little, if anything, to say about these incidents. Unlike cases of Islamophobic violence, they did not lead to calls for greater national reflection on the need to confront anti-Semitism. See, for instance, not for instance, but for reference, see Shire, 2018, Tabarovsky, 2019, Muded, 2015, Hisaye and Sanders, 2017. Let us now turn to how the contemporary U.S. left addresses anti-Semitism. There are relatively few examples of open anti-Semitism in left circles. The Bush-era anti-war movement at times featured anti-Semitic imagery. See, for reference, Arnold, 2015. Images of hook-nosed Jews clutching the world in their hands are not uncommon on posters and banners at protests against Israel. See Wistrich, 2012. Anti-Semitism could also be found in the margins of the Occupy Wall Street movement. A man repeatedly appeared at the Zuccotti Park encampment in New York City holding signs saying, quote, Google Jewish bankers, end quote. He was confronted by a handful of others holding countersigns stating his views did not represent theirs or those of the movement generally. However, a visibly Jewish man was later attacked at the same location after being confronted on the street. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories appear with some frequency in Occupy online forums. A Facebook page titled Occupy Wall Street that had no connection to the actual movement prominently featured anti-Semitic images. Yet this, quote, fake, end quote, page ultimately attracted far more likes than the official Occupy Facebook page. Although unsolicited, the Occupy movement attracted a variety of right-wing sympathizers with different agendas. In a video entitled Occupy Zionist Wall Street, noted white supremacist David Duke praised those who attack the international bank supposedly holding America hostage. The American Nazi Party also voiced support for Occupy Wall Street, lauding its potential for making the, quote, natives, end quote, aware of the influence of Jewish, quote, Wall Street bankers, end quote, stating that, quote, this issue is tailor-made for National Socialists, end quote. It's funny because it says sick here, and it says tailor-made, like the name Taylor, not like Taylor, like someone who make tailors things. It's I love when fucking just like bad grammar in like reactionary shit. It's like the funniest thing. There's this guy I used to go to this gym that was full of a bunch of like fucking like bonehead clowns. It was like a hardcore like powerlifting gym near where I live, and like but it's not like a white supremacist gym. It's like very mixed racially, but it has fucking like, you know, macho racist goons. And there was this guy there that said had a Blue Lives Matter shirt, but he is said like blue live matters or like blue lives matters. Like it was just like grammatically incorrect. It was like fucking hilarious. And it's like, for one, how did no one like register that when they were making the shirt? And then how did this asshole not register it when he was wearing it? And he wore it all the time. But it was it was a funny thing, funny sad thing to observe. It was like you felt bad for him. It was like hateful and um dehumanizing, but also like pathetic. Several Nazi groups attempted to infiltrate Occupy encampments, but were mostly turned away. For reference, see Lyon 2011. At the same time, less explicitly right-wing actors like the conspiracy theorist David Icke were welcomed within some Occupy camps. For reference, see Spencer Sunshine 2014. I have a piece. I don't know when this piece will go up or whenever, but I have a piece that I recorded in my readings of the critical theorist, the young critical theorist Joan Brown, about the show, about different forms of conspiracy thinking that lend themselves towards apologetics for the status quo, but also anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. That's in the book Critical Theory and the Critique of Antisemitism by Marcel Stutzler, who, whenever I share any of his videos, it gets a million dislikes. Because he has written things critical. He wrote the famous essay, I think it's kind of famous within this world, is a critical theory and the critique of anti-imperialism. So, and I was in like a libertarian socialist forum, and like certain clowns on there before I left were calling it a racist, and were calling me a racist too for sharing stuff that is like critical of anti-Zionism and critiques of reactionary anti-imperialism. But like I don't really know why they were. I don't know what libertarian socialist consequences they hope to see arise out of groups like Hamas or any of America's other enemies. But that's just a side point. But yeah, basically the point of what I'm saying is that in that essay, there's a lot of talk about David Icke and the lizard people, which is like, it's also about how like things that go from like that's ridiculous to people be like, you guys have a point. He's got some songs, man. He's saying some things. Anyway, this interest from the right shows the potential for anti-Semitism posed by vague populist and personalistic critiques of capitalist society. More recently, a variety of avowedly intersectionalist movements have been marred by allegations of anti-Semitism. The Women's March has faced a cascade of accusations, including anti-Jewish statements made at their first meeting, noticeably omitting Jewish oppression from public statements and associating with the anti-Semitic, anti-feminist, and homophobic Louis Farrakhan. Farrakhan, leader of the black Muslim organization Nation of Islam, has a long history of making anti-Semitic comments. And like I've said in other videos, Malcolm X was part of this institution up until a year before he died. So, we can speculate about, where he would have gone if he wasn't murdered. In all probability by the Nation of Islam, and though I think some people have said there was some kind of FBI involvement, and they might have proved that, but people have been speculating about it for years. But the Nation of Islam definitely did try to murder Malcolm X, even if they weren't successful. Yeah, that's yeah, they support it. So basically, yeah, go back to the text. The Women's March has faced a cascade of accusations, including anti-Jewish statements made at their first meeting, noticeably omitting Jewish oppression from public statements, and associating with the anti-Semitic, anti-feminist, and homophobic Louis Farrakhan. Farrakhan, leader of the black Muslim organization Nation of Islam, has a long history of making anti-Semitic comments. Poverty Law Center. The group's reaction to critics was defensive and dismissive, eventually issuing a general statement condemning anti-Semitism and transphobia, but refusing to hold Farrakhan and his organization accountable. Sounds right. I mean, why would you criticize Farrakhan if you're pro-Hamas? That was actually I was speaking out of terms there. I don't really actually know the details of this, but I'm gonna assume if they're coming from like the kind of like postmodernist, post-colonial perspective, and not a critical theory or Marxist perspective, or like a deep Marxist perspective, not like or what you might call an esoteric Marxist perspective. I don't know, that's a problematic term. But if you're not coming from that, I'm going to assume that the people that participated in these controversies in the Women's March are probably in the streets right now protesting for the ceasefire. And probably view the pogrom on October the 7th as the resistance. And probably, take great cues from people like Judith Butler, and who say that it's very important to include Hamas and Hezbollah on the global left. So, if they're not going to criticize Farrakhan, if they're not going to criticize Hamas, why would they criticize Farrakhan at home? They're waking the people up. Women's March co-chair Carmen Perez publicly called the issue a, quote, distraction, end quote. Co-president Tamika Mallory called for, quote, empathy, end quote, and the need for, quote, nuance and complexities, end quote, on Twitter. Equivocations like these are unfortunately part of a common pattern wherein accusations of anti-Semitism are dismissed as politically motivated attempts to divide and discredit movements for social justice or as distractions from more important matters. The result is that anti-Semitism cannot be addressed on its own terms, but only indirectly through reference to other issues. In 2017, 3 Jewish lesbians participating in the Chicago Dyke March were asked to leave because they were holding a rainbow flag with a Star of David on it, which event organizers claimed was a, quote, Zionist, end quote, symbol. In 2015, a Black Lives Matter rally in Seattle stopped outside a new marijuana dispensary to decry gentrification. But one speaker used the occasion to accuse the Jewish owner of being from Israel and serving in the Israeli Defense Force. In reality, his family had lived in the community for several generations, and he had never been to Israel. At a subsequent protest at the same shop, another prominent local activist was caught on camera telling the owner to, quote, go back to Germany, end quote, and, quote, let them Nazis get on you again, end quote, implying the long-time local resident didn't belong and should return to face anti-Semitic violence in Europe. For reference, see Brownstone 2017. These incidents demonstrate both the persistence of the anti-Semitic tropes that Jews are malevolent outsiders who are fundamentally alien to and preying upon the, quote, real, end quote, community, and the notion that Israel stands at the center of global evil. The first theme was prominent in Nazi propaganda, given paradigmatic expression in an infamous cartoon from Der Stürmer, depicting a, quote, Jewish worm, end quote, eating its way through an apple labeled the, quote, German economy, end quote, with a caption reading, quote, when something is rotten, the Jew is behind it, end quote. Reminds me of... Sorry, I'll just continue. The second is illustrated as by how frequently otherwise fractious left movements find common ground in anti-Israel activism, highly visible even in movements with little connection to Middle East politics. Jewish Voice for Peace's, quote, deadly exchange, end quote, campaign provides a contemporary example which attempts to project blame for racist violence in the United States onto Israel and Jewish groups like the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, by highlighting law enforcement exchange programs between the two nations that allegedly share, quote, worst practices, end quote, resting on a chain of highly tenuous linkages. For reference, see Elman 2019. Whenever there's like a talk, say like by Haymarket Books or something like that, that's about combating anti-Semitism, they get the Jewish Voice for Peace. And part of the critique of Jewish Voice for Peace is that Jewish Voice for Peace is kind of like, not in a conspiratorial way or something like that, but kind of like for one, the clarity about where it gets money from is not absolutely clear to my understanding. There's some talks about this on like ISGAP, for instance, where they basically, and this is true of like other like ostensible groups that deal with the anti-Semitism, is basically what their function is to say that any claims to anti-Semitism existing on the left in some kind of like substantial or unique way is just a smear. And so they're called in as the experts on the subject, whereas people that are I've never seen anyone from that's done a talk on ISGAP. Maybe they could I don't think they'd bring in someone who's taken influence from someone like Moshe Pistone to discuss anti-Semitism. They're going to get someone from Jewish Voice for Peace. People love Jewish Voice for Peace because it gives it says we're a Jewish anti-racist organization and we don't think X, Y, and Z is anti-Semitic. So therefore, when someone says this, it's fine, even if it has anti-Semitic tropes. I'm not an expert on it. I haven't read the book. I haven't studied Jewish Voice for Peace, but that's generally the critique that people who investigate, who look into and criticize such groups would say about Jewish Voice for Peace. The centrality, back to the text. The centrality of anti-Israel discourse on the left has made it a point of resonance with far-right actors encompassing white supremacists like David Duke and Islamic fundamentalists like from Louis Farrakhan to Hamas. Damn, they made the connection before I did. Ilhan Omar, the first Somali and one of the first two Muslims elected to U.S. Congress in 2018, sparked a fierce anti-Semitism controversy. First, a tweet from 2012 was discovered which stated that, quote, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel, end quote. Recycling tropes of occult Jewish manipulation of the world. For reference, see Bresnahan, 2019. This was soon followed by another tweet which suggested Republican support for Israel was, quote, all about the Benjamins, end quote, and naming the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, as the paymaster. Critics charge that these statements mobilized the classic anti-Semitic trope of a shadowy group of powerful Jews secretly controlling government, reminiscent of the, quote, Zionist-occupied government, end quote, or, quote, Zog, end quote, theory of the far right. While others responded, it was an accurate description of how the pro-Israel lobby works. When I hear the Zionist-occupied government, I hear the part, I'm thinking of like the episode of Seinfeld where they take the cab because they know they take the cab and they find out, or not the cab, but the cab, and they find out, or the limousine, and they find out that it was for the for a white supremacist, and George is like reading out their like manifesto. He's like, the Jews who run this Zionist occupied government, and he's just looking at it like I don't know, so so disturbed. But then he like plays it up because he thinks that the Nazi woman is attractive or whatever, and she's clearly like infatuated with this mysterious white supremacist figure that nobody's ever seen before. Sorry. As Michelle Goldberg, a New York Times columnist who is herself highly critical of Israel, noted, quote, at a moment when activists have finally pried open space in American politics to question our relationship with Israel, it's particularly incumbent on Israel's legitimate critics to avoid anything that smacks of anti-Jewish bigotry. And the idea of Jews as global puppet masters using their financial savvy to make the Gentiles do their bidding clearly does, end quote. Michelle Goldberg. Although Omar herself apologized and graciously thanked her Jewish colleagues for educating her, a variety of left media outlets condemned Omar's apology and doubled down on her statements. The prominent left magazine, Jacobin, which is an unfortunate title in my opinion, unleashed a deluge of headlines proclaiming, quote, Ilhan Omar was right, end quote. Quote, Ilhan Omar is not anti-Semitic, end quote. And, quote, Democrats are failing Ilhan Omar, end quote. See Ackerman, 2019, Coolwin, 2019, Savage, 2019. While some commentators criticized a few of Omar's statements, most defenses focused on the Islamophobia and bad faith of her Republican critics. None mentioned the many Jews who expressed hurt at her words. As previously noted, the contemporary left's definitional identity of standing for equality and opposing racial hatred and discrimination means that, quote, primary anti-Semitism, end quote, overt prejudice and discrimination against Jews is rarely seen on an individual level and is indeed often vocally opposed. Yet as we know, from other forms of racism, the absence of explicit statements of racial animosity does not mean that the bigotry doesn't exist. The above examples demonstrate the left's willingness to overlook or excuse both conscious and unintentional anti-Semitism, especially if it happens in the context of criticizing Israel or defending fellow leftists. Instead of open expressions of anti-Semitism, what we see on the left are various patterns, reactions, and discourses that make it impossible to discuss. In the following sections, we identify 3 common responses to attempts to discuss anti-Semitism on the left: denying, downplaying, and derailing. We will examine each of these dynamics in turn. Shutting down discussions of anti-Semitism on the left, 3 common dynamics. Denial and downplaying. I wonder if they're going to talk about the thing in one of the AK Press books where they're like, oh, anti-Semitism, it doesn't, it's not really a big issue. In fact, we should have some fun with it. Or if they're talking about, how do you say the guy's name? Abdullah Öcalan, or the guy who's like the so-called Bakuninist or whatever in Rojava, or who is in prison right now. Hats off to the Institute for Social Ecology for strongly condemning some of the anti-Semitic comments apparently made in his work. There's like creating a democratic civilization or whatever it's called. I think it's really inspirational that like a group who clearly has sympathy with this man and his politics had the audacity, when they saw something wrong coming out of being produced by him, or something that they thought was unacceptable, they didn't try to at all try to, at least in the Institute for Social Ecology in the United States and the people around it didn't try to downplay it or excuse it. They criticized it firmly, and they criticized the laundry list of people who that text had to have been read by without anyone batting an eye about the content of it. Go look at for anti-Semitism videos on the Institute for Social Ecology's YouTube channel. There's some good shit in there, and you'll learn a lot. I learned a lot. Anyway, understanding themselves as members of a structurally racist and heterosexist society, left activists often show a high degree of sensitivity and self-criticism regarding oppression and domination. Yet on a standard list of, quote, isms, end quote, targeted by the left, capitalism, racism, sexism, and so on, anti-Semitism usually doesn't make the cut. I learned nothing about anti-Semitism when I became a leftist. I learned a lot of things about racism, sexism, and to a lesser extent capitalism because, I was in an anarchist milieu who didn't really spend any time trying to comprehend the critique of political economy at all, even though we were all anti-capitalists. Occupy Wall Street, for example, engaged in lively debates about white privilege and racism within the movement, and also debated how to address the sexual assaults and male dominance that occurred in some encampments. But despite several instances of open anti-Semitism and the widespread participation of right-wing activists, anti-Semitism was not a similar topic of discussion. Although there were no reported instances of overt anti-black racism, this didn't stop it from becoming a key theme for the movement. By contrast, the Women's March had to be forced to include anti-Semitism in their statements of intersectional solidarity. Organization's spokeswoman, Linda Sarsour, suggested that while anti-Semitism exists, it is not a systemic form of racism, erasing the highly systemic nature of the Holocaust and the central role anti-Semitism plays in the worldview of the far right. This creates a tacit hierarchy of oppression on the left, wherein, by virtue of being seen as white, also invisibilizing Jews of color, Jews cannot be understood as victims of racial oppression, overlooking the fact that, according to the far right, they are not. One second. What the hell is her name? Yeah, I remember listening to a talk by Eva Illouz, and it's about, if you look up on YouTube, there's a video titled Undemocratic Emotions, the Example of Israel. It's about populism in Israel. It's very interesting. And it's very interesting to note that despite the existence of the Black Panther movement, so-called, within Israel, which was a movement against prejudice against non-European Jews in Israel, the heart of Netanyahu's popularity actually comes from, to my understanding, I'm not an expert, but to my understanding, comes from the non-Ashkenazi Jewish population, which is a large portion of the Jewish population in Israel, despite what people might have to say about Israel being white. And they're actually the more conservative. It seems like they're actually the more conservative force within Israeli politics. Is the Jews that were probably the descendants of people that were the 800,000 Jews who were expelled from North Africa and Middle East countries in the 1950s. I believe that's the number, 800,000. Maybe it's higher, maybe it's lower. who actually support, so that's the base of Netanyahu's regime. So it's the simplified kind of narratives that leftists often try to reduce things to, um, is not adequate to comprehending the complexity of a lot of the realities that a lot of the instances where anti-Semitism and Israel and Jews are relevant. A textbook example of downplaying is the book The Politics of Anti-Semitism, Cockburn and St. Clair, 2002. Widely available in left bookstores where it is often the only book on the subject. Yeah, I'd like to go into my local radical bookstore and just get a bunch of books that critique left anti-Semitism from a left-wing perspective, and see how the book merchant responds. Widely available in left bookstores, where it is often the only book on the subject, it clearly announces its intention from the first page. Quote, I think we should almost never take anti-Semitism seriously, end quote. And adding, quote, ... maybe we should have some fun with it, end quote. I believe that book was released by AK Press, an anarchist or libertarian publisher that I think was originally from Scotland but is now based in the United States. I feel like I gotta look it up to back up what I'm saying. Yeah, AK Press, Politics of Anti-Semitism. Is that sold by them or is that published by them? Let's see. Yeah, it was published by AK Press. So this isn't something clearly that's limit the left wing anti-Semitism is something not completely limited to post-colonial, or maybe not post-colonial. Maybe it's too broad, but it's not isolated to like tankies or something like that. Funnily enough, there's an article in Jungle World, the German newspaper. It said something to the effect of like one of like the big Stalinist parties there, like it's like a article that was like something to the effect of like, dogmatism's actually is a voice of reason. And Jungle World's not a dogmatic Marxist journal, but it is like a radical left newspaper, and it's like, oh, the dogmatists are speaking reason, but it's like some kind of like fucking like like tanky like Stalinist fucking organization or whatever. Who said who referenced how correctly how responsible the Soviet Union was for the establishment of the state of Israel, voting for it probably the most loudly in the United Nations, and how Israel had to buy guns from the Soviet Union via Czechoslovakia in order to defend itself. And so it was kind of interesting how these Stalinists, which is like rare, were like, oh yeah, our great Lord Master Stalin, and I can't forget the Ukrainian guy at the UN, Gromyko or something like that. Was one of the most loud advocates for the Israeli state in the UN, and it's funny that these tankies who are obviously known for especially for Stalin himself being anti-Semitic and the way that anti-Semitism was deployed in order to smear the Trotskyists in the Soviet Union, and Trotsky and his followers. And it's funny that the way that Stalin, So, but they were saying is like, oh yeah, we have no interest in abolishing the Jewish state of Israel because Stalin was responsible for it in some way, which is a crazy ass reasoning to get from A to B or have a political position. It's fucking nuts, but it's kind of funny because there's some kind of there's definitely historical truth into what they're saying. Whereas the mainstream narrative on the left is that, you know, you know, the West made it because they felt so guilty and they wanted to have access to oil, which I don't think there is significant oil reserves in Israel. I think that's why I don't think Israel's relevant to that. Maybe I'm wrong. Also, the historian Jeffrey Herf has pretty well demonstrated that is it Truman? Truman, who did support this foundation of Israel, was very much personally, he was very much advised against this by the top brass within I don't know the military intelligence and shit like that, because like Stalin and the Soviet, let's say it's the State Department, I think. I'm not an expert on the layers of government. Thought that associated Zionism with communism, and so did Stalin. But when the Israel didn't become communist, but in fact became social democratic instead, and there was these new national liberation movements that were taking place in North Africa and in the Middle East in the 1950s that vehemently hated Israel and advocated for its destruction. They radically switched tunes about the legitimacy of the Jewish state in Israel. I really highly recommend listening to some of Jeffrey Herf's talks. I think he might. I don't know what his fucking politics are, but I think he's trying. He's probably I don't know, probably a liberal, maybe a social liberal, whatever. But I think he translated Alfred Schmidt's something History and Structures of Consciousness or whatever the hell, I don't know, one of Alfred Schmidt's books he translated into English, I'm pretty sure. And kind of Alfred Schmidt being a Frankfurt School person. Yeah, but I'd recommend checking out some of his talks. About the foundation of Israel and who supported it and who did not. And I think a lot of leftists would be surprised how popular the establishment of Israel was within and its foundation by large sections of the left, including the Soviet Union. When the narrative always goes that it was established by, it was a proxy state for, Western imperialism. It seems there might be a pretty good argument to say that part of Israel's right-wing turn, to my understanding, is the support that the Soviet Union had with the more numerous Arab national liberation movements as opposed to the Jewish national liberation movements. I think they're getting on the bandwagon of anti-Zionism was pretty crucial in Israel, for instance, forming a closer relationship with the United States. But I'm not sure. But back to the text. Widely available in left-wing bookstores, where The Politics of Anti-Semitism by Cockburn and St. Clair is often the only book on the subject, The Politics of Anti-Semitism clearly announces its intention from the first page, quote, I think we should almost never take anti-Semitism seriously, end quote. Adding, quote, dot, 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 maybe we should have some fun with it, end quote. On the rare occasion anti-Semitism is acknowledged to exist, it is trivialized. Quote, undoubtedly there is genuine anti-Semitism in the Arab world. The distribution of the protocols of the elders of Zion, the myths about stealing the blood of Gentile babies, this is utterly inexcusable. But so is your failure to answer Aunt B's last letter, end quote. How hilarious. For instance, the Nasser regime, which is often celebrated as a great instance of national liberation. Nasser employed former Nazis to distribute the protocols of the elders of Zion, which I believe he took as fact. Well, I guess he would if he believed in its mass distribution. I think even the Nazis were kind of cynical, at least according to Richard Evans. The Nazis were kind of even cynical about the factual veracity of or the truthfulness of the protocols of the elders of Zion. They viewed it as kind of like, I don't know, embarrassing, even if they agreed with it in ethos. 10 out of the 18 chapters address not anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism's, quote, misuse, end quote, by groups who accuse pro-Palestinian activists of anti-Semitism. Not one contribution deals with the historical background of anti-Semitism in general or the left in particular. Instead, it assumes anti-Semitism is an irrelevant issue, especially in contrast to Islamophobia. This is perhaps unsurprising given the book is co-published by Counterpunch, an ostensibly left magazine that has given space to white nationalists and anti-Semites including Alison Weir, Israel Shamir, Paul Craig Roberts, Eric Wahlberg, and Gilad Atzmon. See for reference Levick 2002, Wolf 2016. What is more surprising is that left authors and publishers would produce a book whose primary function is to downplay and deny the existence of anti-Semitism. Another recent example can be found in the U.S. left reaction to the attack on the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo by Islamists in Paris. Its central concern was not the 12 left-wing journalists murdered by right-wing extremists, but rather the magazine's alleged disproportionate and overgeneralizing focus on Islam, an allegation challenged by an empirical study by Le Monde Diplomatique. Footnote: for an analysis of the context and content of Hebdo cartoons, including documentation of the proportion of covers devoted to Islam, about 538, 483 focused on politics, economics, and sport, while of the 38 focusing on religious themes, 21 targeted Christianity and 7 Islam. End footnote. This is just a side note. Mainstream media, say for instance like Family Guy, which is a show that I personally think is fucking hilarious. I mean, other people think that's like cringe, but you know, I like jokes. I like comedy. I like insensitive comedy. I like shit, dark, gross comedy. As long as what is being suggested isn't being taken like the jokes aren't taken seriously. But maybe that's just something problematic about my personal self. But it would be ridiculous if, say, I don't know, fucking armed Jewish militants, who there's frequently jokes about Jews on the show, as there is about all kinds of folks. Not to say that oppression or every joke is as insensitive as every other joke about each particular group or whatever. But if like a Jewish armed militant group decided to go fucking murder writers at Family Guy, that would be fucking horrific. Uh, it would be horrific to just be like, oh well, like Family Guy really shouldn't have made all those jokes about Jews. They really had it coming. Or we don't, or like maybe like kind of like a softer like, well, it is indeed bad, but we need to look at the bigger picture, which is Family Guy's evilness. That would be, I don't know, that seems like it would be pretty fucking horrific and ridiculous response to me. So when Islamist terror groups do that to a magazine that, like we just said, actually mocks Islam only 7 times out of the 38 times it mocks religion as such. Well, actually, there's a typo here because it says 38 focusing on religious themes, 21 targeted Christianity, and 7 Islam. Unless there's another religion that it also criticizes. That's probably actually what it is. Never mind, there's no typo. I'm making shit up. But like, just the very like idea that that's like, oh yeah, they said offensive shit, so like like terrorism, forgivable, murders forgivable, because someone made jokes that hurt a certain group of people's feelings. Yeah, that's disgusting. It's like people who, sorry, this is not related at all, and this is like a totally more trivial instance, but it's like I fucking couldn't believe how much people would like kind of sort of defend Will Smith for fucking assaulting Chris Rock because he made a joke about his bald ass wife. Like, that's fucking so embarrassing. That like someone would be like, oh yeah, he really, that comedian who said way worse shit to all about all kinds of sort of people, he really shouldn't made fun of her going bald. That's really awful. And he maybe it was a little extreme, but I understand why Will Smith got up out of the audience, out of a bunch of people that were being mocked right to their fucking faces, and he's the only one who stood up and smacked Chris Rock. And people are like, oh man, like the obvious thing is like, oh yeah, there's like a difference between a fucking joke and like physical violence. But for certain people on the left, there's that's there's no that distinction really doesn't matter to them. The difference between like words and actions isn't significant, especially when those words are fucking jokes and not like actual like malicious attacks on Muslims. And also, it's important to note that within France, there actually is groups who actually are anti-Muslim, and explicitly so. And so is the case throughout Europe. To fucking hit a comedy magazine because it offended your religion is not acceptable. And people who on the left who try to make it seem acceptable should really, really reconsider their entire disposition towards political life. Sorry, I'm just ranting here. The U.S. left's central concern was not the 12 left-wing journalists murdered by right-wing extremists, but rather the magazine's alleged disproportionate and never-generalizing focus on Islam, an allegation challenged by an empirical study by Le Monde Diplomatique. While some portrayals of Muslim and Islam in Charlie Hebdo are indeed questionable, many activists completely refuse solidarity with what was perceived as a racist publication, often without knowledge of the French political context or language. Footnote: Richard Seymour's Jacobin article on Charlie Hebdo provides the best but not a unique example. We could find no mention of the anti-Semitic murders in any left publications, only Jewish ones. Yep, sounds right. In the rush to confront the symbolic racism of cartoons and potential for anti-Muslim backlash, the left completely ignored the deadly racism that had already occurred. the murder of 4 Jews in a nearby kosher supermarket carried out by an associate of the attacker. This incident reveals a highly selective anti-racism wherein one form of violent racism, restricted neither to the page nor possible future scenarios, is excluded from left discourse entirely. Antisemitism is therefore not typically recognized as a problem worth discussing on the left. Attempts to bring antisemitism up are routinely greeted with denial, defensiveness, and hostility. Indeed, antisemitism is unique in that the left has a specific term used to dismiss it. Quote, Hasbara. Quote, a synonym for Israeli propaganda. Already in the 1980s, Jewish feminist Irina Klepfis, Klepfis, has called this refusal to engage with the topic, quote, anti-Semitism by omission, end quote. Derailing. The dynamic of derailing has become a familiar dynamic in left and liberal discourse. Derailing describes a situation where a discussion about a particular issue is redirected to a different topic, changing the subject, but also typically reframing it in a manner which justifies or rationalizes the issue being discussed. To give a recent example, conservative opponents of the Black Lives Matter movement tried to derail conversations about racist policing by pivoting to generalized assertions that, quote, all lives matter, end quote. Although left activists are generally sensitive to this dynamic, it happens with great regularity regarding anti-Semitism. Instead of discussing anti-Semitism, activists often immediately redirect its cynical use to justify Israeli policy and silence its critics. In research interviews with left activists, conversations were repeatedly redirected from discussing anti-Semitism to accusations of anti-Semitism and its alleged abuse. Again, this double standard stands out as the contemporary left is not typically prone to doubting accusations of racism or any kind of oppression. That's just a side note for me. If conversations about Islamophobia were repeatedly redirected to talk only about a discussion of racism, If conversations about Islamophobia were repeatedly redirected to talk only about the problem of Islamist terrorism, this would be rightly denounced as derailing a discussion of racism. Generally, such derailments redirect to Israel. Indeed, this dynamic has been described by anti-Semitism scholar David Hirsch as, quote, the Livingstone formulation, end quote. As a result, anti-Semitism can never be addressed by the left as a social phenomenon on its own, but only in relation to Israel. Once again, the double standard is clear. The left would never tolerate discussing Islamophobia only after first addressing Islamic terrorism or Iranian state policy. In these cases, it would be obvious that these are distinct subjects not to be conflated and that racism is by definition an irrational ideology and that doesn't require reasons. Anti-Semitism has the dubious honor of being one of the only forms of racism where the left is often quick to suggest such reasons. This, of course, is the very definition of rationalization. I see this all the time. It's like, I've heard someone call this, probably not a leftist, but like someone called this like, West-splaining? When, someone in, some group that is also ascribes to a form of anti-imperialism also says things that are anti-Semitic. When they say those things, it's well, this is what they really mean. Like, they don't really mean this. They're just, like, mad about, like, Israel. They're not really, like, anti-Semitic. Like they would, whereas if someone says like, oh, like so and so's not really racist, they're just worried about like tight job markets. They wouldn't say that. But they feel when someone says something anti-Semitic, they're like, well, they're just, they're concerned for the lives of Palestinians. Like it's like a kind of like they rationalize anti-Semitism in a way that they wouldn't rationalize anything else. It would be like if they said, incels, they say some bad things about women, but they're really just lonely or something like that. All right, new section. Israel and Palestine. Attempts to discuss anti-Semitism on the left almost always turn into discussions of Israel. We have already provided several reasons why mixing these two distinct issues is problematic. While it is obviously necessary to talk about the Middle East conflict, anti-Semitism must also be taken seriously and addressed on anti-Semitism's own terms. Yet this very conflation, along with the great prominence the Middle East conflict is given within contemporary left discourse, requires careful attention to the specific patterns and forms criticism of Israel takes. To state the obvious, criticism of Israel in itself is not anti-Semitic. Yeah, it says to state the obvious, and I'm going to repeat that. Criticism of Israel is not in itself anti-Semitic. But that's not all that criticism of Israel usually entails. Any state can be criticized. People don't call for that criticism. You can criticize any kind of the concrete policies that Israel does, the limits of its borders, all those kinds of things, the rightward drift, the response to the murderous attack on October 7th, any of those things. You can criticize any of those things, the extent of them, but usually that's not all that's at stake. This is me talking. This is usually not all that's at stake. There's a difference between criticizing vehemently certain trajectories of Israel and calling for the international community, including the most vehement enemies of Israel, such as Hezbollah, Iran, Hamas, of destroying it militarily or dissolving it into a single state, which would, or something like that, a single Palestinian state. Calling for the destruction of Israel is not the same as criticizing Israel. That's just my comments on it. Back to the essay. To state the obvious, criticism of Israel in itself is not anti-Semitic. Yet, as with any form of racism, anti-Semitism is not only or even primarily expressed as explicit racial hatred. It frequently takes the form of coded language, heightened attention to actual events, or the application of double standards. For this reason, distinguishing between anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and critiques of Israel and its policies is not nearly as simple as the left presumes. Increasingly, the standard left response to any accusation of anti-Semitism in the context of Israel/Palestine is to insist on a fundamental distinction between anti-Zionism, which is legitimate, and anti-Semitism, which is racist. Unfortunately, a simple change in terminology does not guarantee that a particular discourse or action is non-racist. For reference, see Kaplan and Small, 2006, and Hirsch, 2018. According to the normal standards of anti-racist practice, this is an uncontroversial fact. Many leftists readily accept as open racism has become less socially acceptable. Racism assumes coded forms, quote, welfare queens, end quote, thugs, end quote, hyper predators, end quote, bad hombres, end quote, etc. The same holds true for anti-Semitism, the historical background being what sociologists Bergman and Erb have termed, quote, communication latency, end quote, i.e., describing how the Holocaust created a public taboo in Western countries on openly anti-Semitic statements. Anti-Semitism thus was one form of, quote, detour communication, end quote. Anti-Zionism was thus one form of, quote, detour communication, end quote, a socially acceptable way of denouncing Jews via the Jewish state. In fact, one easily finds numerous instances where anti-Zionism is indeed motivated by anti-Semitism or is indistinguishable from it. Today, the most explicit anti-Semites, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and fundamentalist Islamists also speak of, quote, Zionist, end quote, rather than or in addition to the more straightforward term, quote, Jews, end quote. David Duke frequently speaks of Zionist control over the U.S. government and was an enthusiastic defender of Representative Ilhan Omar. After years of defense, prominent activists like Gilad Atzmon and Alison Ware were eventually asked to leave the Palestine Solidarity movement for repeatedly crossing the line into blatant anti-Semitism. Left anti-Zionists protesting against the annual Israel Day parade in New York City jostle uncomfortably among Islamists carrying anti-Semitic banners that equate Jews with cockroaches, or proclaim that the, quote, final solution to the Middle East equals nuke Tel Aviv, end quote. Thus, while it is logically true that anti-Zionism isn't inherently anti-Semitic, these and many other examples just as conclusively demonstrate that anti-Zionism nonetheless can be, and historically often has been, anti-Semitic in left-wing spaces. See, Norwood, that's the guy who wrote I've mentioned the book about anti-Semitism and the American far left. I believe Norwood, I think his name might be Stephen, was the author of that. But it says, for reference, see Norwood 2013 and Hardy 2002. Moreover, empirical studies have shown a correlation between anti-Jewish statements and criticisms of Israel. In light of these facts and unwanted political bedfellows, the common left mantra that, quote, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, end quote, is inadequate if the left is to take anti-Semitism seriously. There is no magic safe word that can be used to dismiss accusations of anti-Semitism or any other form of racism. Anti-racists can't afford to simply take words at face value, but must rather closely scrutinize the context, content, and patterns of political statements. For this reason, it is necessary to articulate a consistent set of criteria for distinguishing legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitic forms. Anti-Semitism scholar Alan Johnson, just a note on Alan Johnson. Alan Johnson was a member of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, and now works is like the head editor of the journal Fathom, which kind of tries to create like a new and nuanced, balanced account of the Israel-Palestine conflict, including a lot of people from the left, from different varieties of the left, who criticize the ways that anti-Zionism does in fact slip into anti-Semitism. Some people that have been on there have been like people like Michael Walzer, who was like the editor of Dissent, or maybe still is the editor of Dissent for a long time. Just like I think it's like a left liberal social democratic journal in the United States. Has statements from Alliance for Workers' Liberty. It has Ingo Elba on there. It has Stefan Grigat on there. Has a bunch of people. Not everyone. It's not like a radical left thing or at all, but it has radical leftists on there. It's kind of a pretty open group. And it has people that I would probably very much politically disagree with on lots of topics, including Israel-Palestine, but trying to foster, balanced scholarly discussion about the topic. Anyway, anti-Semitism. Oh, this is a side note too. The most popular video on this YouTube channel was by Alan Johnson, and it's a criticism of Norman Finkelstein. It's gotten a lot of it got a lot of dislikes, and some of the comments in it are fucking crazy. Anyway, anti-Semitism scholar Alan Johnson offers a useful general criterion. Quote, anti-Semitic anti-Zionism bends the meaning of Israel and Zionism out of shape until both become fit receptacles for the tropes, images, and ideas of classical anti-Semitism. In short, that which the demonological Jew once was, demonological Israel now is. Uniquely malevolent, full of bloodlust, all-controlling, the hidden hand, tricksy, always acting in bad faith, the obstacle to a better, purer, more spiritual world, uniquely deserving of punishment, and so on. End quote. Alan Johnson. Another useful tool is the 3D test of anti-Semitism, standing for delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. I think this is actually a really good tool too. I mean, if I was trying to explain someone like what a it's hard to, what is a critique of Israel that doesn't trail off, or at least potentially doesn't trail off into anti-Semitism. The 3Ds would be a good place to start: delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. Note that none on their own is a clear indication of anti-Semitism. Depending on the context, each can simply reflect political priority and emphasis. However, they provide a useful diagnostic framework by which to assess anti-Semitism, especially when several of these dynamics appear at once. All three are common within the contemporary United States left. Delegitimization. Although Israel was established in accordance with international law and the United Nations, Israel's right to exist as a nation-state has been challenged both militarily and politically since its inception. These arguments may be based on anarchist or anti-national claims that all states are illegitimate, on liberal anti-Zionist positions that Israel cannot grant special status and priority to Jews and at the same time guarantee equal rights to all its citizens, or on orthodox religious positions from Jewish groups like the Naturai Karta, who believe founding a Jewish state before the return of the Messiah is wrong. However, in most cases, the delegitimization of Israel makes it almost unique among contemporary nation-states. I really like that they say it may be used based on anarchist or anti-nationalist claims, because that's kind of like what a lot of the people say. I think even like Norman Finkelstein's like, well, I'm a classic communist. I don't really believe in states in general, so it's not really like such a big jump for me to say that Israel in particular shouldn't exist. And when I was on this like when I was talking earlier about being on this libertarian socialist channel, that's the kind of thing that says like, why are we defending states or whatever? They're really just criticizing Israel, but they're like, why are we defending states as such? And it's like, you're not really criticizing states as such at all. You're criticizing one nation state, one type of nationalism, to the exclusion of all other nationalisms, which I'm going to assume you probably view pretty positively. Not making any distinctions between different types of nationalism. A substantial critique of nationalism that's actually universalistic and all-encompassing and consistent wouldn't place special emphasis on critiquing Jewish nationalism, but it often does. This is part of the reason why some of the most sophisticated work or like the most radical work critiquing nationalism, particularly coming out of like the German like anti-Deutsch and stuff like that, they're anti-nationalist, of course, but what they reject is one side, like a kind of false anti-nationalism that criticizes, which more or less affirms or tolerates all forms of nationalism as, unfortunate necessities in a world of nation states, but sets aside Israel to the exclusion of those other states for special scrutiny and condemnation and calling for its destruction. Um, it would be weird. It'd be weird. It would be like, I think when I think about it, I think of it like, it would be like, you know what it might be like? I think an example. This is an extreme example, and it's kind of in bad taste, but I'm gonna use it anyway. Oh, maybe I shouldn't. I'll go for it. Um, like if a business is being Aryanized, right? If a business is being taken away uh, from a Jewish person and given to an Aryan person or a German person as it was during the Third Reich, it would be a really weird response to say when one's condemning that, to say is like, well, why would you defend a capitalist? Like it would be like, oh yeah, this like, and that's kind of like I feel like it's kind of like a similar logic, like, or you could say the same thing about any, right, if it makes you feel more comfortable. If someone took a business away from, you know, if a white person, or the state declared that you could take a person of color's business away, or the state did take a person of color's business away and give it to a white person, um, to say then that, it's like, and criticizing that as uh, racist. And you said, well, why are you defending a business? Aren't you an anti-capitalist? It seems like it's kind of analogous to the anti-nationalist things. Like, why are you, or the anti-state things? Like, why are you defending a state? I thought you were against states. I thought you were an anarchist or a communist or what have you. Why would you defend Israel? It's just another state. Um, it's like, why would you, you single out Israel as a state that was especially ripe for destruction? I don't think it's particularly nationalist to say that uh, the state of Ukraine should continue to exist if the means of abolishing is becoming just a part of the Russian state. That's not emancipatory at all. That doesn't lend itself at all towards self-determination of human beings in any capacity, not just so-called national self-determination. So it's weird, the kind of like confusing, like categorical inconsistencies that people make when they're talking about um, being anti-nationalist or anti-state, when the only state that they really seem to want gone is the Jewish state, which, believe it or not, was actually founded because Jews were persecuted elsewhere prior to and including the Holocaust. It wasn't just white people going on vacation or white people going to Africa to you know exploit the place. There was actual substantial persecution that motivated the Zionist project. It wasn't just white people being white people or imperialists being imperialist or something like that. Anyway, sorry, enough from me. However, in most cases, the delegitimization of Israel makes it almost unique among contemporary nation states. It is this often unstated political goal that has led even fervent Palestinian activists like Norman Finkelstein 2012 and Noam Chomsky 2014 to criticize the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which in their estimation views the very existence of Israel as illegitimate, whereas they seek to change its politics, however radically. I don't know if those are actually. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think those are Norman Finkelstein's politics. Maybe I'm wrong, though. What do I know? Demonization. While the purpose of political propaganda is to incite criticism of Israel, often takes especially virulent forms that veer into total demonization. Left critics frequently go beyond targeting specific government policies to question Israel's basic right to exist. Israel is routinely characterized as a uniquely bloodthirsty, evil, and powerful state, all of which mirror the historical tropes of anti-Semitism right down to the harvesting of organs, the killing of small children, or the poisoning of wells. It is commonly depicted as a brutally racist dictatorship engaged in, quote, genocide, end quote, including historically inaccurate comparisons to South African apartheid and highly insensitive analogies to the Nazi regime. Footnote. The, quote, apartheid designation, end quote, overlooks some inconvenient facts. To take but one example, the Israeli Knesset currently has proportionally more Arab Israeli members, 13%, than the U.S. Congress has African American representatives. Arab and Palestinian citizens of Israel can vote and have political parties. The Nazism analogy similarly ignores that Israel has not engaged in the calculated extermination of Palestinians, something well within the capacity of Israel's far more powerful military. Indeed, it must overlook their unilateral withdrawal from both Gaza and Sinai, a strange course of action if, quote, genocide, end quote, is the goal. None of this diminishes ongoing violence in the occupied territories, but accurate terminology matters. One second, sorry. Okay. Although there is unfortunately no shortage of nation-states that violate human rights or that are engaged in bloody land disputes, the left concentrates disproportionate attention on Israel compared to other governments. Next door to Israel, the Syrian government and the Islamic State have both been documented using chemical weapons against civilians, but Israelis are labeled, quote, people who kill children, end quote, in left media, as the title of one Jacobin article bluntly declared, recalling the blood libel trope. Schupak, 2014. While many counter by saying this heightened scrutiny is warranted due to the close relationship between the United States and Israel, this defense does not address the left's lack of attention to similar relationships with allies such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, or India. There is no correlate BDS movement targeting these regimes, nor do these conflicts routinely emerge in unrelated movements. Often this demonization does not stop with the Israeli government, but extends to all Israelis anywhere and any time. A large section of the BDS movement holds all Israelis everywhere accountable for the crimes of their government. As a result, any event anywhere in the world today that features Israelis, regardless of political commitments or sponsorship, is likely to be targeted for protest and boycott. Even more troubling, this demonization is expanded to also include non-Israeli Jews, as in case of Jewish American musician Matisse Yahu being barred from playing a Spanish music festival in 2015 without first stating his position on the Israel-Palestine conflict. No other left movement holds an entire nation, its individual citizens, or members of an entire religious faith directly accountable for the crimes of their or not their government. In fact, attempts to do so regarding other groups targeting Muslims for professions of national loyalty after 9/11, for example, have been rightly deemed racist. Such demonization is often accompanied by ideological generalizations which assume particular political groups or tendencies within Israel, such as the far-right Israeli political party Likud, speaking for the entire population. This stands in sharp contrast to assumptions regarding the other side, as when leftists claim Hamas doesn't speak for all Palestinians, despite garnering 45% of the vote in the 2006 Gaza election. For reference, see Anderson 2015 and Hassan 2019. Demonization is so pervasive and all-encompassing that even progressive aspects of Israeli society, such as gay rights or ecological movements, are dismissed as mere cover for brutal policies towards Palestinians. As a result, even liberal activists inside Israel must confront not only opposition at home, but internationally organized campaigns against their alleged, quote, pinkwashing and, quote, homo-nationalism, end quote. When everything and everyone associated with only one nation is deemed evil, demonization is clearly at work. Double standards. As these examples show, a variety of double standards are applied to Israel and no other nation. We identify 5 of the most common forms pertaining to salience, state formation, state foundation, self-understanding, self-determination. The double standard of salience translates into a political context where the left assigns vastly more attention and importance to the issue of Israel/Palestine than any other conflict in the world today. Israel is one of the few issues that unites a typically fractious left. This one conflict is so central to the U.S. left's self-understanding that it is often a highly visible element even in demonstrations for completely unrelated topics like climate change, police brutality, or gay rights. I'm going to say that's true. When I go to the local radical bookstore, which is like a coffee shop as well, literally every talk I go to, it gets brought up, no matter what is the context of the talk. Or, and it's like whenever I'm sitting there, I hear people talking about it. This was even prior to the current Israel-Hamas war that's going on. This is just all the time. People love to talk about this Israel and Palestine. With like really no substantial critique of capitalism going on. Or at least from just or maybe that's an exaggeration. But yeah. It's also interesting, I'll say this in other videos, but there's a really interesting talk with Alan Johnson on YouTube where he's talking to this like really conservative Jewish man. He's talking about anti-Semitism on the left, and this guy's like kind of trying to say that leftism as such is anti-Semitic, and Alan Johnson's like, no, he's like, I'm a socialist myself. I consider myself a democratic socialist, and it's interesting that he's talking about he's from Great Britain, and he's talking about like the Corbyn campaign and it wasn't it wasn't pro-Palestinian policies that made him popular. It was the anti-austerity measure. And Alan Johnson was saying, and the thing that's interesting is that compared to their rhetoric on Israel, their political platform really isn't all that radical. It's really just like basic social democratic stuff. So the contrast between not even a very radical domestic economic program and a very like verbose and like inflammatory and extreme foreign policy, particularly towards Israel and other issues, is striking, and it's kind of something that I've noticed as well. anti-capitalism plays a very, very, or especially an emancipatory anti-capitalism, is a very far down the list priority for most of the leftists that I run into, even if they wouldn't say that as such. What they do say is more stuff to the effect of like, prison reform, police reform, obviously talked in the radical language of abolition, within the confines of capitalism, of course, even if they acknowledge the limits of that, or they talk about where they talk about anti-imperialism, like on the campus that I go to school at. The one left group that is there after the YDSA chapter there disintegrated, and which most of the YDSA people went to afterwards, is a group called Anti-Imperialist Action, whose entire thing is just jerking off to any opponent whatsoever of the United States. Maybe it's a crude way of putting it, but more or less. The kind of people who view October 7th as the resistance. Whereas any substantial talk about the critique of political economy, critique of capitalism, the critique of anyway, sorry, I'm going off. The double standard of salience translates into a political context where the left assigns vastly more attention and importance to the issue of Israel-Palestine than any other conflict in the world today. Israel is one of the few issues that unites a typically fractious left. This one conflict is so central to the U.S. left's self-understanding that it is often a highly visible element even in demonstrations for completely unrelated topics like climate change, police brutality, or gay rights. This ideological omnipresence suggests that the left views Israel as both a unifying factor as well as a political linchpin upon which various other forms of oppression rest. Yet at the same time, various other occupations, civil wars, and violent conflicts receive little or no attention from the left. There are no sustained left campaigns targeting other contemporary examples such as India's annexation of Kashmir, Turkey's brutal suppression of the Kurds, Russia's occupation of the Crimea, or Iran publicly executing gays. This double standard is even more glaring for North American leftists who target settler colonialism while in Israel while directly benefiting from its legacy at home. Daniel Miller, or no, it's David Miller, was like this isn't about the United States, but in the UK, was a professor who was fired for making, saying some conspiratorial shit, and then when people, bitched about it, I don't know. I don't think he was actually fired for that directly. It was for like some kind of unprofessional conduct or some shit like that. But like everyone on the left in the UK kind of like rushed to his defense. And now he's employed by Press TV, which is the international. It's like Russia Today, but for Iran. And Jeremy Corbyn, I don't think in immediately recent times, so maybe in immediately recent times, went on there frequently. Or maybe not frequently, but he definitely went on there despite how horrific Iran is in terms of civil liberties, gay rights, and women's rights. That's just a side thought. The double standard of state foundation marks the foundation of Israel alone as artificial and violent in contrast to the presumably peaceful and, quote, organic, end quote, process of establishing other states. Because it calls for an end not only to the occupation but the very existence of Israel, anti-Zionism has come to represent the obvious, quote, radical, end quote, position on the left. Yet this radicalism rests on deeply liberal and ahistorical assumptions about the nature of nation-states. It assumes Israel is a uniquely violent exception rather than the more mundane rule. Anti-Zionism selectively ignores that every state in existence today is equally, quote, artificial. What the fuck? Come on. Oh, my computer's fucking farting out on me. Why, Lord? Why? God, it's gonna take me back. Ah, you son of a gun. Okay, back to where we were. This radicalism of anti-Zionism assumes Israel is a uniquely violent exception rather than the more mundane rule. Anti-Zionism selectively ignores that every state in existence today is equally, quote, artificial, end quote, birthed and maintained by violence, dispossession, and exclusion. While the violence that accompanied the foundation of Israel is not unique, the late historical moment, as well as political context of Israel's establishment is. This brings us to the related double standard of state formation, which sees Israel as anachronistic, a colonial and imperial regime engaged in an outmoded form of colonial expansionism. Yet once again, this feature is not unique to Israel. Borders have been continuously redrawn throughout history to create new states. 34 have been founded since 1990 alone, many of which were the result of civil war or land grabs lacking any legal legitimacy, as evident in the ongoing cases of South Sudan and Western Sahara. Various existing states are also currently engaged in violent territorial expansion and the suppression of local populations. Turkey, India, Russia, Ethiopia, and Morocco, to name a few. This is before the war in Ukraine. This is written in 2019. State foundation and expansion are frequently accompanied by forced population transfers, yet the demand for the right of return for Palestinians is almost exclusively directed at Israel. Although this has been a persistent sticking point holding up negotiations for Palestinian statehood, it is rarely a condition for other partition states. For example, India and Pakistan. Left discourse also seldom discusses the treatment of Palestinian refugees by states like Syria and Egypt, or mentions the hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees exiled from neighboring Arab countries in the wake of 1948. 800,000, I believe, is the number. None of these examples serve as justification for Israeli crimes or any other occupation. Rather, the lack of attention and activism around them illustrates a profound double standard operating within left political discourse, one that happens to resonate with historical patterns of anti-Semitic exceptionalism. The double standard of self-understanding results in criticizing Israel as a specifically ethno-religious state. Yet this position ignores that this fact holds true for several other states today and for most in history. One would be hard-pressed to find leftists who criticize the specifically Muslim nature of the Islamic Republic of Iran or the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Almost every nation in history is at one point linked to a state religion, and yet every nation enforces restrictive ethno-racial immigration policies. But it is only the Jewish state that is routinely criticized by the left for its specifically religious character and demographic manipulation. While leftists are right to reject both ethno-religious nationalism and restrictive immigration/demographic policies, they are far from consistent, criticizing some forms, U.S. and Israel, Christian and Jewish chauvinism, while ignoring or even rationalizing others, Islamic nations, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist ethno-religious nationalisms. Lastly, the double standard of self-determination results in acknowledging this right only for Palestinians. A wide variety of movements of Palestinian self-determination are championed by the left regardless of political content, while Zionism is denounced as synonymous with racism and violence, equally oblivious to specificities of historical form or political content. This holds true more generally for the U.S. left's view of the Israel-Palestine conflict as a whole. Although this history is long and complicated, the double standard of self-determination results in an extremely one-sided and simplistic account. Palestinian dispossession and repression is very real, and as the stronger force, Israel has the greater power and responsibility to resolve this conflict. At the same time, the left selectively ignores various important historical facts on the other side. The Jews also have historical ties to the region and their own history of displacement, the long subsequent history of persecution, exclusion, oppression, and expulsion, culminating in the Holocaust, that as a result of these historical oppressions, Zionism as a national liberation movement and state-building projects started late in the game and under historical conditions not of its choosing, the armed attacks on Israel, including civilians from its inception until the present. See Linfield 2019 and Memi 1973. Despite this complicated history, most leftists primarily perceive Palestinian suffering, fear, and rage as legitimate. At times, this translates into support for reactionary groups like Hamas, like I said, supported, called friends by Jeremy Corbyn, regarded as part of the progressive left by Judith Butler, and celebrated by what's his name, Andreas Malm, celebrating Hamas. I can't speak on Malm's relationship with Hezbollah, but I can say that as far as Hamas concerns, he celebrated. He celebrates their the armed struggle, so-called, of Hamas, despite their fundamentalist politics. By contrast, the feeling of fear, insecurity, and historical persecution among Jewish Israelis are hardly seen as legitimate. The left often portrays the rise of right-wing Palestinian political actors like Hamas as a regrettable but understandable reaction to violence, while the rise of Likud and Israel's shift to the right are never interpreted as a bad reaction to anti-Semitism and violence against Jews. Although both groups are irredentist and predicated on their opposition to the peace process, the dominant left position is to only acknowledge this regarding Israel, refusing to admit there are those on the other side who will never accept peaceful coexistence with the, quote, Zionist entity, end quote. Just a side note, that's precisely why leftists support them, is because they will never accept peaceful coexistence with the, quote, Zionist entity, unquote. In my opinion, it's not like the anti-Zionist, not in an abstract sense, but in a practical, concrete, from the river to the sea, no more Israel existing, is the politics of Hamas, and I think it's largely supported by lots of people on the left. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like it seems wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems wrong to suggest that the left doesn't admit this. I would say they celebrate it. It's great that Hamas is not interested in a peace process. It's hideous that Likud is, but it's great that Hamas is not. because Hamas, sorry. Okay. Basically, I'm just saying, I don't think they're afraid to admit it. I think a lot of them think it's a very good thing. In a conflict where there has been trauma and loss of life on both sides, one does not have to equate the suffering of parties to recognize that resolution is impossible if it only considers the claims of one side. Exactly. But most leftists would prefer to pour gasoline on the fire, in my interpretation. They don't want a peace process. They want total victory for one side. To review, while anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not necessarily the same thing, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism can be the same thing. Simply insisting on the language of anti-Zionism is no guarantee that they do not overlap, as demonstrated by a brief glance at the discourse used by the aforementioned anti-Semitic, quote, anti-Zionist, end quote, neo-Nazis. We have offered the three Ds, end quote, test as one possible criterion to help distinguish legitimate critiques of Israel from anti-Semitism. We're asking if they rely upon delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. As there are many legitimate grounds to criticize Israeli policy, identifying double standards is an especially useful analytical tool. To this end, we have identified 5 common double standards: salience, state foundation, state formation, self-understanding, self-determination. The fact that other human rights abusing states, Russia, Iran, China, Turkey, or Saudi Arabia, or settler colonial societies, the United States, Canada, and Australia, are not held to the same standard of critique denote clear double standards. Today, anti-Zionism is more than a political position taken towards the Middle East conflict. The rejection of Israel has become a distinctive marker of belonging to the radical left. According, for reference, see David Hirsch, 2016. According to Shalomit Volkov, in 2006, the rejection of Israel has become a form of subcultural badge that declares one is on the right side of history, symbolizing a rejection of colonialism, imperialism, racism, and nationalism, collectively represented by Zionism and embodied in the State of Israel. It has been argued that this shift reflects a deeper crisis of the left that started during the 1960s and continues to the present, a search for revolutionary subjects abroad in the face of increasing powerlessness at home. For reference, see Gitlin 1993 and Pistone 2006. I would say that that's a very accurate statement. I think of just anti-imperialism in general, but I think it's definitely true of Israel conflict. Is that Israel-Palestine conflict? Is that the left has very broad, radical visions for what it would like to see society be like in comparison to what society is currently like under the conditions of a capitalist mode of production. But they feel utterly helpless to do anything about capitalism. So what they'll do instead is focus on making the world, destroying Israel and thus which will somehow solve the conflict in the Middle East or all conflicts in general in that region, abolishing the last relic of imperialism, or one of the last relics, or the main relic, and creating a multipolar world where the U.S. is no longer the only superpower, but there's multiple spheres of concentrated power in the world by nations with large armies prepared to attack one another. So, solidarity with X, Y, and Z, as long as it's just, shows how against the American state you are. Anyway, unfortunately, this fixation on the Jewish state as the primary or secondary after the United States locus of power and evil in the world reproduces a central trope of anti-Semitism. Making sense of the present. The importance of historical context and left theory. Fully explaining the reasons for these positions towards anti-Semitism within the United States left is beyond the scope of this article, so we can only briefly touch upon them here. However, it is important to stress that in our analysis, these political patterns do not stem from conscious and open anti-Semitism. We are not saying these dynamics are motivated by anti-Semitic hatred, but are rather the result of unexamined assumptions, myopic political analysis, and importantly, a genuine but inconsistent concern for the suffering of others. Nevertheless, the result is that the left has set an inordinately high bar for what constitutes anti-Semitism, in effect defining it out of existence, at least on the left. That, just as a side note, that bar is far lower for other issues of social exclusion. The first factor is the, until quite recently, relatively low level of open anti-Semitism in the United States. This has dramatically changed since 2016 as the Trump presidency has legitimized more brazen forms of racism in general and anti-Semitism in particular, and as the alt-right and resurgent neo-Nazi movement have begun to visibly target Jews once again. For reference, see Hawley 2017 and Nywart 2017. Yet until this recent upsurge, it was largely understandable that left activists prioritized the far more visible and common forms of anti-black and anti-Arab racism. But as a result, while leftists are generally well aware of how these forms of racism have structured U.S. history, they often remain ignorant of the equally long history of anti-Semitism in America. This has included residential segregation, employment discrimination, and even lynching. For reference, see Curl 2017, Stember 1966. In 1654, Peter Stuyvesant, General Director of the Dutch New Amsterdam colony, which later became New York City. Is that where the name Bed-Stuy comes from? Bed-Stuy, do or die. In 1954, Peter Stuyvesant, General Director of the Dutch New Amsterdam colony, which later became New York City, urged that, quote, the deceitful race, end quote, of Jews should not, quote, be allowed to further infect and trouble this new colony, end quote, with their, quote, customary usury and deceitful trading with Christians, end quote. Almost 200 years later, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt could still state matter-of-factly, quote, this is a Protestant country and the Catholics and Jews are here under sufferance, end quote. Although less visible today, anti-Semitism has shaped American history. The second important factor in the relationship of direct financial and military support that exists between the U.S. and Israel, a bond which is bipartisan but associated especially with the political right. This governmental alliance also aligns with relatively positive attitudes towards Israel within the general population, according to a 2019 Gallup poll. This generally positive governmental orientation towards Israel results in an oppositional position by the left that seeks to challenge these political norms and make the Palestinian plight more visible, intervening in a conflict supported by their tax dollar. However, this specific relationship can also blind the left to the broader context. It easily misses that strong anti-Israel sentiment in many other places in the world, such as Germany and many Middle Eastern countries, is often fueled by anti-Semitism. It also often translates into a distorted view of U.S. support, which ignores the roles played by other international players and their geopolitical interests. Moreover, it can lead to an inflated sense of the power of the, quote, Israel lobby, end quote, reproducing the notion that an unseen cabal of Jews control the most powerful nation on earth. For example, Walt and Mearsheimer and Noam Chomsky. The third factor concerns the political actors who address anti-Semitism in the United States. Generally, the main groups that focus attention on anti-Semitism are conservative and right-wing organizations or activists, scholars, etc. And it is true that these organizations and individuals often enough do respond to any criticism of Israel with accusations of anti-Semitism. Yet this perception creates a situation where even groups like the Anti-Defamation League, a human rights organization which, quote, fights anti-Semitism and all forms of bigotry, end quote, monitors hate groups, is considered right-wing solely on account of their support for Israel. This political context has created a, quote, boy who cried wolf, end quote, situation where many leftists instinctively distrust allegations of anti-Semitism or see them only as politically motivated smears. For many on the left, anti-Semitism has become an almost inherently right-wing issue used to weaken the left. The prominence and visibility of Holocaust commemoration in the United States, long institutionalized in monuments, textbooks, and popular culture, is yet another factor. A Shoah commemoration with its depiction of Americans as the heroic liberators of World War II enjoys broad mainstream support. Leftists frequently treat it as a political concern that is irrelevant or even counterproductive. This can lead to a, quote, victimhood competition, end quote, which falsely imagines that one form of historical commemoration necessarily diminishes the remembrance of forms of other historical oppression, especially the extermination of Native Americans or African slavery. As a result, the painful history of Jewish oppression can be trivialized or reduced to cynical political manipulation. This is, in fact, the basic argument of Norman Finkelstein's book, The Holocaust Industry, published in 2000, which was also read in some left circles. I would say a lot of left circles, but maybe they have empirical data that I don't have. The final factor that can blind the American left to anti-Semitism is the existence of a thriving Jewish community. Jews in the United States can take for granted a relatively safe and stable political environment that does not exist in many other places. Debates within the Jewish community around the meaning of Jewish identity, social justice, and Israel look and sound very different when transposed into political contexts that do not share the same basic assumptions or face the same threats. The intensity, closeness, and emotional connection to questions of anti-Semitism in Israel often have very different meanings when Jewish communities that are obscured or overshadowed when these debates take place in other contexts or locations. These historical and geopolitical factors are exacerbated by trends in contemporary left theory. One is the rise of critical race theory and critical whiteness as the predominant theoretical concepts for addressing racism. For instance, see Delgado/Stefancic, 2017, Crenshaw et al., 1995. Despite the important contributions of these ideas, their framework of, quote, white privilege, end quote, provides no political vocabulary to talk about the oppression of Jews, who can only be understood as privileged white people. This effectively erases their specific history of domination and the process of contingent, quote, whiteification, end quote. Brodkin, 1998, Kivel, 1998. But it also overlooks the fact that not all Jews are white or of European origin. Mizrahi and Jews of color face anti-Semitism as well as anti-black and/or anti-Arab racism. Another political factor is the prominence, especially since 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror, of an anti-imperialist political frame within many parts of the left. This perspective focuses primarily on the power and crimes of the United States and Israel, understood as the heart of global imperialism. I'm going to say that this was definitely, I'm not an expert on these topics now, but this was definitely what kind of made me interested in politics for sure when I was in high school and stuff. I remember the first probably radical book I read was Noam Chomsky, and I can specifically remember seeing the word capitalism in that book and not knowing what it meant. And it was probably, and I think it was about, like, Crimes of America or something like that. Whatever the book title was, it basically is, what the thing was reducible to. Ascendant during the late 60s New Left, this ideology was often predicated on the supposed impossibility of social change within the United States, viewing both the working and ruling class as bought off by the spoils of racism at home and empire abroad. Much of the left started to pin their hopes on a global struggle of the rest against the West, embodied in third world liberation struggles like those in North Vietnam, Cuba, and Angola. Transforming the role of domestic radicals to fighting imperialism from within the belly of the beast on behalf of movements in other places in turn encouraged an uncritical orientation to even reactionary anti-Western movements and discourses. See Pistone 2006, Hensman 2018, Stutzler 2018. I would really recommend Rohini Hensman's book, Indefensible. If you're interested in understanding how the contemporary left has come to embrace sort of what Hensman would call neo-Stalinist positions that completely abandon notions of humanism, secularism, democracy, feminism, put all those important features that any kind of leftism should orient themselves towards on the back burner in the name of just the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of anti-imperialism becoming successful. Okay, but you should read that book, though. It's from Haymarket. They probably wouldn't have printed that book, though, if it was more critical of left anti-Semitism. Thus, many forms of anti-imperialism are frequently oblivious to or supportive of the growing power and crimes of new imperialist powers like Russia, Iran, China, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. This binary worldview is also a disguised variety of Orientalism, as it only sees, quote, the rest, end quote, in relationship to the, quote, West, end quote, denying all other political actors any real agency and casting them only in the role of eternal victims. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the problem with, like, viewing national self-determination as the same as self-determination itself, right? Is that if the a society can be totally sovereign and totally independent of imperialist powers. I mean, in terms of, like, having control of its own government or whatever. I mean, obviously, it doesn't fall outside of the role of the chaos of international relations and the marketplace, and be totally unwilling or disinterested or incapable of delivering on anything approaching substantial self-determination of people. Yeah, but these kind of, like, homogenizing of entire countries, of, like, the United States and, the global South, is deeply, deeply oversimplifying. This dramatically simplified understanding of power overlooks or demotes various domestic forms of domination and class exploitation by subordinating them to the primary evil of imperialism. See? Called it. I'm a fucking genius, bro. This variety of crude anti-imperialist politics has become more popular since the attacks of 9/11 and is especially apparent in U.S. left discourse around the Middle East. Political action by Israel is almost always depicted by the left as coldly calculated, motivated by racist and murderous intent, whereas Palestinian action is presented as an automatic or natural reaction, rather than conscious political choice, whether it takes the form of suicide bombing civilians or Hamas's explicit anti-Semitism. While the left claims that anti-Arab racism constitutes the essence of Zionism, the left refuses to acknowledge that anti-Semitic ideology is one of many factors that influence politics in the Middle East, or is willing to overlook it. Indeed, anti-imperialism's logic of, quote, my enemy's enemy is my friend, end quote, has created strange political bedfellows, right-wing isolationists and Marxist-Leninists, Islamic fundamentalists and queer activists, anarchists and reactionary nationalists. They ain't lying. This is serious. As a result, leftists have often tolerated anti-Semitic positions or even openly support right-wing political groups. The feminist queer theorist Judith Butler provides one example in 2006 when she claimed that understanding Hamas and Hezbollah as social movements that are progressive on the left, part of a global left, is extremely important, end quote. For many, these groups, quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, opposition to Israel overrides their stated ideological, their ideology of hostility. Sorry, there's a typo here. For many of these groups, quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, orientation to Israel overrides their stated ideology of hostility towards Jews, queers, and women. Now, this is not just something that right-wing cranks say, Some people, there's kind of like, I think some of these people have, made some important points about the way the certain important people on the left have made points about how right-wing governments engage in anti-immigrant and other racist policies towards, in the name of women's rights, right? I think, what's her name? I think it's Sarah Faris. Has talked about, I think she calls it femo nationalism, where it's kind of like, oh yeah, we have to protect women's rights from these, unruly hordes at the gates or something like that. It's basically like the thrust of their logic. And one can think because the right wing exploits that kind of like exploits, like, for example, I think George W. Bush, when commenting on Biden's pulling out of Afghanistan, is like, well, I'm sorry for the women there. Just because someone like George Bush would say something like that, who's, clearly not interested in anything remotely approaching substantial equality for women, that doesn't mean that the Taliban is not a misogynist organization. Yeah. So just because conservatives mock queers and women who say they support Gaza, and which partially, and for them, partially entails supporting the government, which constitutes the resistance there. When they say, like, call them on their hypocrisy, that shouldn't be like an argument that's made strictly by right-wing people. I think that's a very much an argument that can come from within queer and feminist spaces against one-sided blind support for one form of nationalism over another, especially when that nationalism is guided hegemonically by Islamic fundamentalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-feminism. Don't mind me thinking out loud. Certain modes of criticizing capitalism can offer another theoretical opening to anti-Semitism. For reference, see Battini 2019, Fine and Spencer 2017. Populist and conspiratorial critiques of capitalism attack only one aspect of capitalism, finance, interest, greed, as if these were possible without the allegedly, quote, good side of capitalism. This ignores such core characteristics like exploitation, competition, and private property. Such critiques personalize capitalism by targeting bankers or individual firms, treating the problems of capitalism as moral rather than systemic, while ignoring the structural forces which compel ruthless competition among capitalists. By focusing on corruption, greed, and other personal failings, this narrative suggests that the solution is simply eliminating the few, quote, bad apples, end quote, which spoil the bunch. Historically, these bad apples have frequently been identified as Jews. Occupy Wall Street's vague populist frames of the 99% versus the 1% and Main Street versus Wall Street allowed for mass identification with the movement, but it also left it open to right-wing and anti-Semitic interpretations, both of which had small presences on the fringes of the movement. While the various historical, political, and theoretical factors described above attempt to contextualize and explain the particularities of left discourse on anti-Semitism in the United States, they neither excuse nor rationalize them. The pattern's dynamic, subtle double standards and not so subtle violent outbursts of anti-Semitism are all too real, as is the left's continued reluctance to address it as a problem. This makes it a challenge left social movements and thinkers must seriously confront. The political consequences of ignoring and challenging anti-Semitism on the left. Before concluding, let us first avoid persistent confusions by reiterating what we are not saying. That anti-Semitism is the worst or most pressing form of oppression today. That the left is a hotbed of rabid anti-Semites, that any and all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Instead, we are suggesting anti-Semitism remains a, quote, invisible prejudice, end quote, for much of the contemporary left. We suggest this is due to two main reasons. First, when it does occasionally surface, its articulation is not generally explicit, but rather takes coded and fragmented forms. Second, it is a form of racism that cannot be addressed. The left lacks the conceptual tools and political will to do so. As previously noted, we do not believe this is the result of anti-Semitic intent, but rather unexamined assumptions, faulty political analysis, and social pressure to confront left conventional wisdom. To conform to left conventional wisdom. I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, right there, the pressure to conform, or the pressure to engage in what the Frankfurt School. I can't remember who. I think it was Adorno. Maybe it was someone else though. The pressure to engage in ticket thinking. I think this, so I must think this, and this. And so you kind of have to take, instead of taking like your positions a la carte based upon what historical and social scientific research and theoretical investigation, just kind of say, oh yeah, this is what like the rules are, And I think that's a way. Honestly, I think that's a way a lot of the left like teaches its young people things, is it teaches you the rules, right? Like when I was young, it was like this is what race is, this is what privilege is, this is what this is, and not acting as if these are like kind of like obviously they're real things and obviously they should be confronted. They're not so totally opaque that you can't like obviously call them when you see them, but they're actually like the frameworks that are being applied are actually like they're debated, and there's conflicting approaches to them, and one has the freedom to decide based on reason and evidence which positions one should adhere to. And that's not really how the left operates. Like, this is what race is, and this is how you be anti-racist. These are the rules, or you're a piece of shit. And it doesn't. And one of those things is like, you better hate Israel. You better hate Zionism. Like, before you even know it, like, Zionism is evil, without really any kind of like interrogation into like the history of that. Just like understand that this is the case. I don't know. But yeah, all part of the social pressure to conform to left conventional wisdom. Nonetheless, the various political blind spots, peculiar bedfellows, and double standards we have addressed stand out by the uncommon prominence, tolerance, and emotional weight the left assigns them. These dynamics have real political consequences. In many cases, it becomes impossible for Jews and allies to talk about anti-Semitism, especially without being accused of apologism for Zionism, which is ostensibly the worst thing in the world. Many Jews state that they feel they are allowed into the left only if they publicly espouse a commitment to anti-Zionism and are ethnically singled out for a political loyalty test. Yeah, I mean, I'm not Jewish myself, but I'm sure if I like was just like a Jewish person who like had some like connection to Israel in some way, even if I disagreed with large swaths of its policy or whatever, to say that I think it, like, being like confidently saying like, yeah, I should think it should have continued to exist. I do think you would be chased out of left spaces, not like formally, not like in a physical way, but formally you'd be shunned, or informally you'd be shunned. That's absolutely true. That's true for myself, and I'm not a Jewish person. Not to make myself some big martyr or something like that. It's like, oh, look, I take the unpopular position, so I'm therefore right. No. Because I don't really know what position I take. I'm still learning in this shit. But after reading, after coming across some of these kinds of ideas, these critiques of left anti-Semitism, I had a strong will to learn more about them. It's not something I had thought about very much, for most of my adult life. But I'm glad I'm doing it now, and it's interesting and it's important. Yeah. The Revolutionary Communist Party magazine is explicit, quote, Jewish people who resent being resented for Israel's crimes, ... need to loudly and unequivocally speak out against Israel's crimes, end quote. This formulation holds Jewish Americans responsible for Israeli state policy, while also blaming the victim by implying that Jews deserve racism unless they take action against Israel. Similar suggestions that Arabs and Muslims be singled out for symbolic statements of loyalty would never be condoned on the left. When the right makes this demand, it is rightly condemned as racist. Yet this is a common complaint from Jewish leftists. At times this leads to actual expulsion, as it did at the Chicago Dyke March, but more frequently it takes subtler forms of day-to-day pressure and threat within left spaces. Since, according to opinion polls, 70% of American Jews believe that, quote, caring about Israel is an important part of my being a Jew, end quote. In practice, this means disqualifying the vast majority of American Jews from participating in the left. American Jewish Committee, 2018. We also suggest that these attitudes reflect the relative weakness of the left today. Moishe Pistone in 2006 argues that The contemporary radical left, delegitimized, powerless, and lacking a viable revolutionary agent akin to the working class, has abandoned its utopian aspirations and been reduced to passively cheering for or against other states or movements. With the possibility of progressive social change seemingly off the table, many leftists have proven willing to embrace any form of, quote, resistance, end quote, to capitalism, the U.S., or Israel, regardless of their politics. This, quote, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, end quote, logic often projects its own values onto actors that do not share them or simply endorse reactionary political aims. This makes confronting anti-Semitism an important task for rebuilding an emancipatory left. What concretely does this task require? First, deeper forms of analysis of capitalism, racism, global politics, and the Middle East, which accurately understand the complexities of the contemporary social world, and which can offer a liberatory political vision that distinguishes its critics from those of conspiracists, nationalists, theocrats, and anti-Semites. It entails being aware of our immediate political context and its historical specificities, but also keeping in mind the different contexts and histories found elsewhere, including current political developments like rising anti-Semitism in Europe and the Arab world. We must revise and update our analysis of racism and acknowledging that many of our inherited concepts have little to say about anti-Semitism. Although there is a rich literature on the subject, most of the left are unfamiliar with left theorists and historians of anti-Semitism, such as Michel Battini, Werner Bonafelt, Ellen Willis, Robert Fine, Moïse Pastone, or the work of the Frankfurt School. This requires ongoing educational work, including workshops, forums, panel discussions, and publications. It calls for increased awareness of contemporary anti-Semitic violence and discourse, demonstrating solidarity with its victims, and launching new political campaigns which proactively address anti-Semitism. Sorry, there's a footnote that I missed. The footnote's attached to the sentence. This, quote, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, end quote, logic often projects its own values onto actors that do not share them or simply endorse reactionary political aims. And the footnote says, one example of this naive type of coalition building. In 2010, Iran President Ahmadinejad met in New York City with over 100 activists from the peace movement, including Code Pink religious groups, independent media organizations, and Palestinian groups in New York under the banner of creating peace between the people of the United States and Iran. None of these left groups in attendance bothered to criticize Iran's human rights violations or Ahmadinejad's anti-Semitism, baffling and enraging many Iranian left groups. Oh, I gotta look something up. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he is like Ahmadinejad is like a Holocaust denier. Yeah, on Wikipedia it says, I mean, it's Wikipedia, so take it for what it's worth, but, you know, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has issued a number of statements claiming the Holocaust, as is commonly accepted, is, quote, a myth and a, quote, lie. His words have been publicly repudiated by world leaders from many countries, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and others, including Iranian academics and expatriates. In a speech given at the Columbia University on the 24th of September 2007, Ahmadinejad stated that he did not deny the Holocaust, but he didn't see what was wrong with asking questions about it. In September 2009, in response to the international outrage, Ahmadinejad was reported to say that the angering of, quote, professional manslayers is a source of pride for us and will not stand in our way, end quote. It also says here that in December 2005, President Ahmadinejad banned Western and, quote, offensive, end quote, music from state-run radio and television stations. The ban follows a ruling in October by the Supreme Cultural Revolutionary Council to ban Western songs from Iranian airwaves. Popular forms of Western music, hip-hop, jazz, rock, have been banned in Iran for many years, since the days of Khomeini. At the same time, some forms of Western music, such as classical, are regularly aired on state radios. So yeah, this guy's a fucking piece of shit. But, you know, anti-imperialism. Okay, end of that footnote. Most crucially, it requires making anti-Semitism a topic the left takes seriously. The recent wave of anti-Semitic violence in speech has sparked some long overdue discussion on the left. In 2017, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice produced Understanding Anti-Semitism, a primer on anti-Semitism from a left movement perspective. Other groups and outlets have started to discuss the topic and at times pointed out the left's silence. For reference, see Ward 2017 and Bovey 2017. Yet much of the renewed attention still focuses exclusively on the right or replicates the same problems described here. This includes the Jewish Voice for Peace anthology on anti-Semitism, published in 2017, featuring essays by anti-Zionist activists, not scholars of anti-Semitism. It focuses on the Christian and racial anti-Semitism of the political right, gives ample space to Islamophobia, but says little about forms found on the left. And while it devotes a third of the book to, quote, fighting false charges of anti-Semitism, end quote, it refuses to consider that criticism of Israel can ever be anti-Semitic. This approach ensures the left will be vigilant towards the anti-Semitism of its enemies, but not of its friends. As with past struggles to confront racism, both within the left and in society at large, it will be a difficult process that involves challenging basic assumptions and disrupting received political categories. But ultimately, this process is a rewarding and necessary one. Any left worth the name must demonstrate its commitment to uprooting all forms of racism and domination. Confronting the current invisibility of anti-Semitism can only make it stronger. Thanks for listening, and thanks you for hearing and listening to my extensive mutterings to myself.